So now that we're back in the classroom, I want to go over a couple quick and easy tips on how to bring your photo to life. And if you're concerned, what software should I use? Don't worry about that. If you have Lightroom, that's great. If you have Capture One, that's great. If you have any editing software at all, you should be fine and good to go. Some of these things are the same features that are available if you edit your photos in VSCO on your iPhone. So don't worry about it. You know, if you have access to contrast and clarity and all that kind of stuff, you're gonna be fine. So today I'll be actually working in Lightroom, and I wanted to also call to your attention the difference between why earlier I told you we want to shoot in RAW versus JPEG. And one of the biggest reasons, and I can only illustrate this probably with my hands to explain it the best, is that if you shoot with JPEG and you don't get the right exposure or you mess something up, your room to correct it is about this big. Now, if you shoot in RAW, you have way more flexibility. So don't be fraught if you did shoot with a JPEG, because some of these corrections will still work. But if you shoot in RAW, be excited that if you shot too dark or you shot too light, you can bring that picture and push and pull it back to where you need it to be in order to still look like a usable and beautiful image. So we got a couple images that we shot outside, and I'm gonna just walk you through a couple different easy tweaks you can do to your photo just to bring it to life. Nothing too heavy lifting. So one of the first images I got is I saw a girl running across an advertisement on the street. So one of the first things I like to do is take a look at the composition and make sure it was sort of how I had pictured it. If it wasn't, I'll tweak it a little bit. For this image, it's a little off kilter. There's a section in Lightroom called Transform that'll automatically like make sure the picture is leveled and looks all even. So I'm just gonna click Auto. That's really easy. It'll turn it for me. And now the picture looks like I shot it and I didn't have any tilt to my camera. Then the next thing I'll do is I'll jump up to the main panel on your Lightroom is the basic area where it deals with white balance, exposure, contrast, things like that. And the first thing I'll do, as we talked about before, is white balance. I don't know what the white balance was when we shot this, so I'm just gonna click Auto and let the computer sort of guess where it should be. Below Auto, there's an area that says temperature. Now that is directly related to white balance. And when it auto corrected, it was a little bit warm, and I remember the day being a little bit more cold, a little bit more blue in the sky. So I'm just gonna turn that down just a little bit so it doesn't feel too warm. I want it to be more realistic for this photo. And then I'm not gonna play with exposure. It looks like we nailed the exposure, meaning we got the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO pretty good. So I'm just gonna mess with contrast a little bit to make this pop. And just a basic definition of contrast basically strengthens the difference between your lights and your darks. It just makes the image pop a little bit. So I'm gonna turn that up a tiny bit. And then I'm gonna go down here. She's wearing a black outfit, but when I zoom in here, you notice that it's still, everything looks like it's perfectly lit, so I'm not gonna worry about whether or not I need to bring the shadows up. There's no crazy highlights in there. You see the white, it all looks pretty clean, nothing too bright, so pretty balanced exposure. So I'm gonna go down to clarity and really make this punchy. You might not notice, but at the top there's this histogram, and below the histogram there is it shows me my metadata. So it shows me exactly how I shot this picture. I shot it at a 1600 ISO. I shot it at f2.8, so wide open, and I shot it at 1/2500th of a second. And because I did that, I had a trade-off between using that ISO and losing a little bit of my sharpness. So because I lost a little bit of the sharpness, I want to use clarity, which is sort of like a smaller version or more pinpoint version of contrast. I'm going to use that to sort of punch up and make it appear to be a little bit sharper than how it was shot. So I'm going to turn that up to like a 15. Maybe, you know what, for this, just so it looks more drastic, let's go to 25. And then there wasn't a ton of color in this picture, but I want to get a little bit more from the brick. So I'm going to turn this up just a little bit, just to get a little bit more saturation. It's very, very subtle. You can see that the blue is just a little bit richer in this dress behind her. Her skin's a little bit richer. The brick's a little bit more reddish. So it just adds a little bit more life to the photo. And then everything else I pretty much skip. Sometimes I play around with sharpening. Not always a necessity. Lightroom will give you sort of a out-of-the-box sharpening, so you don't really always have to mess with that. Now, the one thing that I do want to call your attention to, as we discussed before, if you shoot with a higher ISO, sometimes you're going to deal with a little bit of digital noise. So Not sure if you'll be able to pick this up by zooming in, but we'll make sure you're able to see the image. But when you zoom in here and you look at sort of some of the darker areas or areas where there's a little bit more color concentration, you'll start to see a little bit of the grain. And sometimes, like on my camera, I can shoot at 1600 and you don't really see a lot of bad stuff. On a cheaper or more inexpensive camera or less advanced camera, at 1600 you probably see a little bit more digital noise. On this image, there's not really a lot, and actually the noise that's in the picture looks a little bit like a good grain, like something you'd see on film. But if you do have an image that you had to shoot at 6400, for instance, I'll show you the area that you want to go to sort of tweak that in to help your image out. There's a panel, if you scroll down on the right side of Lightroom, there's a panel right underneath sharpening that says noise reduction. And under noise reduction, there's a bar, a slider bar that's called luminance. And that's the bar you want to use if you're shooting in a low light situation and you have to use that ISO. It really helps dial back and smooth out some of that digital noise. So what you want to do is just drag the slider, and it's just a taste, you know? You don't want to overdo it, because if you overdo it and put it on 100, you start to lose sharpness, contrast, everything becomes like butter instead of sharp and nice. It looks like you cook the image, if you will. So don't go all the way to 100 ever, but I like to play around with this and slide it anywhere between like 5 and 25. That's a good safe space to get rid of some of the digital noise without doing too much damage to the picture. And then there's other bars below it. There's one called detail and contrast. For the purpose of what you're doing, you probably won't need to touch that. If you do feel like what this little tweak isn't helping, make sure you go up on the Adobe site, check out the glossary. It'll explain all these little tools and how to get the most out of them. But for now, just use the luminance slider underneath noise reduction. That'll help smooth out anything from low light. And then the other slider under noise reduction to use is the color slider. So just like luminance, it cleans up digital noise, but what it does is it works more closely with any sort of noise that is entering in the colored, the more punchier parts of the photo. So, you know, if there was a lot of digital noise around this blue or in her skin, it will sort of attack that area instead of just getting the noise that's in the shadows or the darker areas of the photo. And same thing with this slider. I wouldn't push it past 50. You want to keep these items as low as possible. Just like ISO, you want to, any corrections you do to the actual integrity of the image, you want to keep them minimal as possible. Stylistically though, like we said when we started off this image, if you want to play around with contrast, clarity, vibrant saturation, you can push them a little harder, but just make sure that your image still has a natural feeling. You don't want people to know that you retouch. One of the key things about editing a photo is to not make people feel as though they're looking at something that was digitally altered, especially if you're somebody that likes to shoot clothing or e-commerce stuff or food photography. You want it to be appealing and make it look a little better than what it was when you shot it, but you don't want to make people feel as though they're looking at a cartoon image. So that's that one image. As you see, there's nothing drastically different, but it does add a little bit of pop to it, a little bit of, it comes off the page a little bit better. The next one I want to do is this coffee cup, and no, this is not an advertisement for Gasoline Alley coffee, although I was told the coffee was good. I had a tea. We're going to just play around with the same things we did. Again, I shot this one at an ISO 125. I shot it at an f-stop of 2.8, and I shot it at a shutter speed of 1/160. So pretty slow, but no camera shake, because it was still a pretty fast enough shutter speed to handhold. And there's not a lot of noise in this one because we shot with the ISO so low. You see, I'm punching in really close. You can really see what the aperture is doing here. At 2.8, the only thing in focus are her fingers and the label on the coffee cup. Everything else, right behind, you can't even tell that there's a person behind it. Everything else is really blurry. So that's how beautiful aperture can treat your picture if you want to get a creative sort of spin on blur and depth of field. So for this image, it already looks really great. I feel like it's a little on the dark side on the coffee cup, so I'm going to punch up the exposure maybe 0.1 or 0.2. Nothing big. I just want it to sort of pop a little bit more and feel a little alive. Then I'm going to tweak the contrast a little bit, maybe put like a 5 or an 8. And don't worry about the numbers. The numbers aren't important. You're just going to season the dish to taste. That's it. So I'm going to punch it up to about an 8. The blacks look really good, so I'm not gonna mess with the shadows at all. If anything, sometimes I want the blacks to look a little richer, and I can turn the shadows down a little bit. But this one, it looks really great. The whites look good. I'm not even gonna play with the white balance. Looks pretty spot on. And then just to punch up the coffee cup and the fingers on the glove, I'm gonna use clarity again. I'm gonna show you what it looks like if you do a lot of it. This is at 50. And see the difference between how that black and you start to see sort of the lights get punchier, the darks get punchier. Now, if I took this off, it's a little bit smoother. So you want to be careful. You don't want to let the pendulum swing too far. So I'm going to go back to about a 20. That's a sort of normal fine area. So that's a little punchy. The saturation looks pretty good, but let's add a little bit because there's that red ring at the bottom of the cup. And so that's a little bit of a richer, punchier, cool image. And then there's nothing else. We shot this at a low ISO. We don't need to worry about the noise reduction. Everything looks great there. This wasn't a building with lines in it or anything, so we don't have to worry about it fixing any distortions or anything like that. And I happen to hold the camera correctly and straight, so the coffee cup looks nice vertically. So this is pretty close to what would be a great final image. So let's go to a picture we shot with really low light. This image I shot at 6400 ISO, one that you will want to stay away from. But I'm going to use this picture, 6400 ISO, 2.8 on the aperture, 1/2000 of a second for the shutter speed. I'm not going to do any tweaks here. I'm just going to call out two other things you can do in Lightroom that will help sort of polish off your image, or if you're seeing any distortion. There's a section on the right panel called lens correction. And sometimes, especially if you're using a wide angle lens or a zoom lens, there will be some barrel distortion, or there'll be some distortion from the lens. What I like to do every time if I use a lens like the 2470, the 24105, is I go over to this lens correction section and I click on Enable Profile Corrections. We're not going to get into this, but what you'll see automatically, especially when you load your own pictures in, is the image will seem to sort of open up. It won't feel rounded anymore. It'll flatten out. So I'm going to do this one more time. I'm going to take it off and I'm going to turn it back on. So what it does is, based on a lot of profiles, Canon or Adobe has all these profiles for Canon, Sony, all types of lenses, and they have these formulas already baked in. You click it, it figures out what lens you shot with, and it fixes all the distortion issues with your camera. No thinking required. So turn that on. It'll fix distortion and it'll fix lens vignetting, meaning the darkness around the edges of the lens, and it'll open up that picture. And then the other thing with this one, especially if you're shooting something that's on a shelf, or you're shooting a building that's from far away or from looking up at a building, you'll find that the lines aren't always straight in the camera. This is me shooting a bookshelf where it's feeling a little off kilter. So again, we'll go down to transform and just click auto. And if that solves your problem, you're good to go. If you want to click on a couple of these other things, like level is just horizontal, vertical is your y-axis, and full will sort of do both at the same time. Auto will do whatever it feels that the photo needs for you to do. And then guided will allow you to work with some lines and figure out what lines you want it to correct based on. Don't worry about that. Go with auto. You'll 90% of the time get a great image out of it, or get a great a fix to it, and then you're good to go. So with this picture, again, I'm not doing any sort of aesthetic changes. I'm really just showing you how to use the lens correction and transform tool. And you combine all these things: exposure fixing, white balance fixing, contrast, clarity, saturation, and a little fixtures like lens correction and transform tool, and you'll be ready to start rocking and rolling with a picture to toss up on your Instagram, your website, your blog, or wherever you want to use your photo.